A teaser trailer is meant to, as the name implies, tease its audience. Provide a section of carefully curated scenes that draw the audience's attention while leaving them wanting more. And in that respect, I can say both of Breath of the Wild 2's trailers so far have done that pretty well. What these trailers have shown us is a direction, but little more than that. There are few concrete details that can be established based on these trailers. Many things can be inferred, but nothing presented as fact. So when I find myself looking at these trailers and devising what may sound like some crazy out there theories, I remember that little is set in stone and that sometimes the best theory can be the craziest of the bunch. In today's video, we're not exactly interested in the most grounded or realistic ideas regarding Breath of the Wild 2's plot, but instead the most fascinating doors of opportunity that this game's current lack of clarification leaves open. And to help me out with exploring a myriad of ideas today, I've invited some friends along. Tyler Townsend, Edible Incredible, Nehru, and Newborn Killick to each give us their observations as well. 5 theories, each presenting their own take on what the sequel's trailers have teased us of. So without further ado, let's get started. One idea that I've been thinking about a lot for the sequel is a twin story dynamic. Breath of the Wild 2's first trailer put a big focus on showing us both Link and Zelda exploring a cavern together, leaving many to speculate for the past 2 years that Zelda could play a more prominent role in the sequel. When the second trailer finally dropped at E3 this year, however, the most we saw of her was her tumbling into a black abyss. If we take this scene at face value, it implies that yet again Zelda is out of the picture for this game. But I'm not entirely convinced yet. She could have survived this fall and landed in a new area, been saved by Link with some ability from the Spectral Hand, or even have fallen through some dimensional wormhole transporting her to a new version of Hyrule. Suffice to say, I don't think this scene is a sure indicator of Zelda's lack of a role in Breath of the Wild 2. I think there is a chance that Breath of the Wild 2 could tell us 2 different stories, one from Link's point of view and the other from Zelda's. Maybe this could explain why development is taking so darn long. They're developing 2 adventures for the price of 1. Now, this isn't the first time I brought up the possibility of Zelda taking her own adventure parallel to Link's, but today's twist is the circumstances by which those 2 stories could unfold. Back in 2019, after the first trailer for Breath of the Wild 2 was revealed at E3, I remember seeing some amazing fan art put together by @Redundance on Twitter, and this art sparked a desire for a shift in character dynamic from Link I never knew I needed. An evil Link. Now, I'm sure some of you might scoff at the mere notion of taking Hyrule's Golden Boy and making him a malice-possessed side villain in the vein of Girahim or Zant, but I personally love the idea. You know those old interviews I brought up a few times on the channel where Zelda producer Eiji Aonuma said, if we have Princess Zelda as the main character who fights, then what is Link going to do? Taking that into account and the idea of the balance of the Triforce, we thought it best to come back to this original makeup. That's actually one of the weakest excuse answers I've ever heard for an interview like this, but what if he was being serious? What if they couldn't think of a single use for Link in a game alongside a playable Zelda until they resorted to making him the villain? I mean, it would definitely give him something to do. So anyway, where does this idea stand today? Why do I bring it up? Well, I'm happy to say that with what the second teaser trailer showed off, I don't believe this idea is entirely out of the realm of possibility. This scene right here is the key, where Link's arm and even the Master Sword are being engulfed by malice. Now, the rest of the squad and I deduced that what we think is most likely happening here is that Link and the Master Sword will be corrupted by malice, causing the Spectral Hand to attach to Link as the only way to stop the spread. But if we can suspend that more likely scenario for a moment, let me tell you about my crazy little theory. What if the corruption we see taking hold of Link in this trailer isn't immediately stopped by the Spectral Hand, but more a lifeline for Link to later escape its hold? Basically what I'm saying is this kind of corruption is not easily quelled, and will require Link to go on his own spiritual journey in his head before he can wake up and regain control of his body. Link sets off on a journey throughout the Hyrule of old, the Hyrule of the Spectral Hand, but only in his head. Meanwhile, his body is possessed by malice, bringing out suppressed parts of his personality to become the villain of Zelda's story in the present. So there you have it. Twin adventures, one taking place with Zelda in the present, and the other a vision of the past in Link's subconscious. A concept that, funnily enough, has already been explored in the Zelda series once before, in Link's Awakening. The difference here is that Link's dream is only one half of a greater story, and that he remains active in and outside of his dream. If Zelda and Link truly both embark on different playable journeys in this game, I think this would be a fantastic setup to start both those adventures.
These very strange structures that look a lot like torii gates can be found on most, if not every single island that we see in this one shot at the end of the second trailer. Torii gates generally signify one crossing into a sacred place, so maybe these areas have been acting as a sort of seal to keep the evil that we can clearly see emanating from Ganon, or at least who we assume to be Ganon, at bay. However, the awakening of Ganon that we see in the trailers may have proven too strong for these seals to hold. Maybe there's an evil energy pouring out from a vast cave system below that needs to be destroyed to put Hyrule back together. If this were the case, then we could expect to see many more dark caves instead of the fairly futuristic looking challenge areas that the shrines presented, fitting in with the more dark tone that we see in the first two trailers. Now put a pin in that for a second, and speaking strictly as a functional piece of gameplay, maybe some of these islands are a replacement for the towers, which would be an amazing place to use the paraglider from, and the areas below them could be replacements for the shrines. The original shrines were also underground, and this would make a very clever way to make engaging gameplay from these huge holes that would be left by some of these large land masses.
Breath of the Wild 2's new trailer certainly gave a lot of potential for what its new story could be. I think it would be incredible for this game to have a split focus between Link and Zelda. Let me set the stage. The Kingdom of Hyrule was freed from Calamity Ganon's hold, but yet the coming days after Link and Zelda's victory would produce a blood moon. How could this happen? Link and Zelda would ponder, prompting them to search for the cause of Ganon's continued evil. The pair set out to search below Hyrule Castle through a long-forgotten cave system that eventually brings them upon Ganondorf's body. The presence of the goddess's reincarnation in the spirit of the hero causes something to stir in the comatose corpse. Ganondorf awakens and the ground beneath their feet starts to quake. Link pulls out the Master Sword to defend Zelda. The hand-sealing Ganondorf can't hold him down as malice erupts out of his body, swarming Link's right arm and rendering it useless, and he drops the Master Sword. The earth gives way, they fall.
Whoops.
The spectral hand rushes to save them, but it's no use. Link can't hold on to Zelda with his arm heavily injured. She plummets deep into the dark chasm below. The spectral hand, sensing the malice running through Link's arm and into his body, quickly attaches to him to prevent further spread. Link passes out. When he comes to, he is no longer underneath the Kingdom of Hyrule, but high above it. The spectral green hand manifests into a spirit, the spirit of the hero from 10,000 years ago. The spirit tells Link that he is poisoned by Ganondorf's malice and must quickly find a cure before it consumes his whole body. Additionally, until he cleanses his body, he won't be able to wield the Master Sword and seal the Gerudo King away. The spirit brought Link into the heavens to find a cure and undergo trials as he traverses from island to island through the Torii Gate structures. Back beneath the castle, Zelda awakens from her fall. She checks her surroundings only to find the mummified Ganondorf reanimating back to life and turning his attention to Zelda. He raises his arms and lifts the chunk of rock Hyrule Castle is sitting on into the air. Looking to find something to defend herself with, Zelda sees a bluish glow resonating nearby. She hears a familiar voice. It's the Master Sword. She scrambles for the blade. Ganondorf sends his malice for her, but before it can reach her, Zelda takes up the Master Sword, and the spirit sleeping within the blade quickly teleports her away from Ganondorf's harm. Zelda reappears still underground, but far out of Ganondorf's reach, at least for now. She turns to look at the spirit that saved her life. It was Fi, and with her guidance, they would need to restore Zelda's sealing powers and make their way out of the depths of Hyrule to reunite the Master Sword with Link. Once both Link is cured of malice and Zelda's divine powers are restored, they set out for the floating castle to end Ganondorf, once and for all.
What's up guys, it's Edible Incredible, and today I'll be describing a narrative idea of mine for Breath of the Wild 2. So my idea revolves around Breath of the Wild 2's obvious connection with Skyward Sword. As we know, we will be exploring some blissful sky islands, which are heavily inspired by Skyward Sword's sky. Or at least, I'd greatly assume that this was where their inspiration grew. Regardless, a common theory nowadays is that we will be traveling back in time to the era of the first calamity, some 10,000 years ago. If this ends up being the case, 10,000 years is obviously a thick amount of time. Who knows where exactly this time period would fall in the fat chronology that is the Zelda timeline. I think the presumed location is simply right before Breath of the Wild, at the very end. but this isn't confirmed just yet. No matter how far back we'll travel in time, the connections to Skyward Sword are eminent. Something that may not be as obvious is a link between the two distant heroes. Skyward Sword Link was designed with the motion controls in mind. Because of this, he's the first ever Link in the 3D series that wields swords in his right hand. In Breath of the Wild, Nintendo kinda made the same excuse as to why he's righty, even though there isn't heavy motion controls. If I remember correctly, they explained it by stating it's because the control stick is on the right side, which isn't the best reason in my opinion. Some people might say it's because of his memory loss, but I personally don't buy that either. Now that we know they took direct inspiration from Skyward Sword, does these two Links being the only ones in the 3D series that are righty mean there's more connections between them than meets the eye? Are these Sky Islands just the first indicator as to how the narrative will be interlaced with the legend of the first hero? Or am I crazily overthinking this just a bit? Since this isn't exactly a theory video and more so focused on being a fun idea video, to sum it up, mine is if we travel all the way back to the Sky era. Now, maybe this is before or after the events of Skyward Sword, even if it involves Demise's first awakening during the war with the original goddess Hylia. It'd be pretty bonkers to see. If, and obviously this is a big if, this happens, it'd nicely explain why the goddess Hylia chose to make the first hero righty, to show an appreciation for the time-traveling hero, who in this case would have helped her out in the war. Anyway, that's just my far-fetched idea for Breath of the Wild 2.
Breath of the Wild made a lot of callbacks to previous games in the series, and with the remains of sites like Lon Lon Ranch and the Temple of Time, it felt like a game that was pretty connected to the legacy of the series. But what if Breath of the Wild 2 was even more connected? What if Breath of the Wild 2 solved the timeline once and for all by making it circular? This is the idea that Breath of the Wild 2 is going to create a circular timeline. This theory requires a certain amount of buy-in. It requires that you believe Nintendo's word when they say that Breath of the Wild is the last game in every timeline. If you don't agree with Nintendo, you probably won't agree with this theory. But if you do, or if you're just curious to hear the crazy stuff that I come up with, then listen on. So let's jump right into it. The islands that we see rise in Breath of the Wild 2's trailer are actually what would become the islands we see in Skyloft, and the game ends with Ganon either turning into or creating Demise. Breath of the Wild 2 leads directly into Skyward Sword, causing the timeline into a constantly repeating loop. I know, this seems like a stretch, so let's get into the proof. So Breath of the Wild leaves us with an apocalypse. Calamity Ganon comes to power and ravages the land, decimating the kingdom of Hyrule and leaving nothing but pain and suffering in its wake. In the aftermath, we're left with the post-apocalyptic Hyrule, the land totally littered in the ruins of a once prosperous kingdom. Now think about this. What do we see fairly often on the lands of Skyward Sword? Abandoned structures, seemingly built by Hylians. Maybe as islands rise in Breath of the Wild 2, and part of the earth ascends, the buildings left behind become the ruins we see in Skyward Sword. What about Demise? He's the original bad guy, right? He created Ganon, not the other way around. Well, maybe that isn't necessarily true. The dispute comes from what Fi informs us of when we fight him. She says the following: "This eternal being has conquered time itself. It is the source of all monsters. According to tales passed down through generations, it appears differently in each epoch and to each person who lays eyes on it. There are two significant points of interest here. First, that he appears differently in different time periods. Can you see where I'm going with this? Demise hasn't always looked the way he does in Skyward Sword. It is possible he could have taken on plenty of other forms. Perhaps a previous form could have been in a more bestial state full of pure rage. Maybe Demise's previous form could have been Calamity Ganon. So what do we know about Demise's actions before Skyward Sword? Well, we know that prior to being sealed, he gathered an army of monsters and attacked Hyrule, slaughtering the people on the surface and leaving a ruined Hyrule behind. Doesn't that sound identical to what Calamity Ganon does in Breath of the Wild? This slaughter could be directly referring to the Calamity itself, and the monsters could be the Guardians. Now let's take the other point of interest into consideration. According to Fi, Demise is the source of all monsters. It could be argued that Ganon is the source of monsters in most games he appears in, but for for the vast majority of instances, it isn't really directly stated to be the case in the same way it is in Skyward Sword. The exception is, of course, Breath of the Wild. In Breath of the Wild, we see the creation of monsters through Ganon's power. During the Blood Moon, monsters are created and revived before our very eyes. They are formed out of purple malice, which is identical in shade to the malice that we see in Skyward Sword inside the evil crystals. It seems like there are a lot of things tying Calamity Ganon to Demise in a way closer than the other Ganon incarnations, and I posit that this could be because Skyward Sword takes place simultaneously before and after Breath of the Wild 2, resulting in a circular timeline. But how could that happen? How could Demise cause the timeline to bend in on itself so dramatically? Once again, Fi tells us how he can do this. It's actually one of the very first things she says. Let's take a look at that flavor text again. This eternal being has conquered time itself. This sentence is of immense importance and does a huge amount of heavy lifting. It actually offers us two separate ideas that work in tandem to support the idea of a circular timeline. First is the idea that Demise has conquered time itself. We know that Demise is immensely powerful, probably more so than any of his future incarnations. Through his sheer power and hatred, he's able to cast a curse that lasts countless generations. If Demise also has mastery over time itself, it's within reason to believe that after being struck by Link's fatal blow, as he stands with his fist gripped, slowly running out of power, he expends the remainder of his energy, rewriting the very laws of time itself. And in making his curse, he writes it into fate that his incarnations will eventually grow to such immense power that it will wipe out the people of Hyrule again, and cause the goddesses to make the earth rise into the sky once again. His incarnation would become less human and more of an unrestrained force of will, which would allow one last incarnation to resurrect Demise in earnest and start the cycle all over again, with a new Skyloft and another cloud barrier. Perhaps the incarnation to resurrect him is the very figure we see in the trailer, the last Ganondorf before he becomes Demise again. This explains why he's called an eternal being. It's an odd thing to call somebody who bites it after a single game. Even if he does reincarnate into Ganondorf, the different Ganondorfs and Demise are hardly the same person. But if Demise is destined to be reincarnated in full every time the timeline makes a loop back to Skyward Sword, then his title of eternal being makes total sense. And there you have it. Skyward Sword is both a story prequel to every game and a story sequel to Breath of the Wild, and Breath of the Wild 2 will be the game to connect them. Probably not true, honestly, but a heck of a lot of fun to talk about. Obviously, there are a lot of loose ends, and I'll actually be addressing some of those points in a future video, and this video will feature the man Xenogamer himself, so keep your eyes peeled if you'd like to see that.
So, what'd you guys think? Whose theory topples them all? Who had the best idea here today? Make sure you let us know in the comments down below. And I want to give a huge thank you to my good friends Tyler, Edible, Nehru, and Newborn Killick for joining me here today. I highly recommend you guys go check out their channels. They all do fantastic stuff, and you will find the links in the description below. I think I'm not alone when I say that one of my favorite things about being a Zelda fan is just thinking of the wackiest, craziest theories I can before a new game releases. Sometimes it's just fun to follow a lead and see where it'll take you, and I think it took us today to some pretty interesting places. Will any of us end up being right? Who knows? That's the luck of the draw. But hey, until that time comes, all speculation is valid, and in the end, it's all about having fun, you know? I hope you guys enjoyed the video. As I said earlier, go check out Tyler, Edible, Nehru, Newborn Killick. They're all great guys. They make amazing stuff. And it's a direct order from me. When the video's over, go check them out in the description box. You will not regret it. If you guys liked the video and you haven't subscribed to me yet already, you can also do that. That would be really cool. I'd appreciate it. You can also like the video to help YouTube share it around and get it to more people so they can learn about all our amazing ideas. And if you want to see more of me, you can follow me on Twitter at XenogamerYT, join the Discord server with a link in the description below, and come by the Twitch channel every Friday night for new streams. Thanks again for watching, guys. You have yourselves a wonderful day, and I will see you soon with more new videos. Until then, bye-bye!